the idea behind becoming indistractable is to be the kind of person who strives to do what they say they're going to do. You don't have to do everything all at once. You don't have to do every technique in the book. I want to give you a lot of arrows in your quiver so that you can use them at your will to become more indistractable.
Welcome to the Become a Writer Today podcast with Brian Collins. Here you'll find practical advice and interviews for all kinds of writers.
168 hours. It doesn't matter if you're Stephen King or if you're writing your first ever short story. We all still get the same amount of time each week to use or waste or spend writing. So how exactly can you get more from your writing time? Well, that's what we're going to cover in this week's podcast episode, where I interview the author Nir Eyal. His new book is called Indistractable, and it's one of the most interesting non-fiction books I've read this year. The book provides a number of different strategies and tactics that can help you become an indistractable writer or creative professional. Well, what does it mean to be indistractable? Well, if you think about it, have you ever sat down in front of the blank page and, you're writing away your first draft or your manuscript, and then suddenly a notification pops up on your phone, and before you know it, you've gone down a Twitter black hole, or you're looking at random YouTube videos, and then you're getting up to answer the doorbell, and before you know it, the whole day's gone by and you haven't written much at all. Or have you ever started to edit a manuscript and found something that you need to check, and then you look that up on Wikipedia, and before you know it, you're on a pop culture site, or you're reading movie reviews or game reviews? Well, if you have, don't feel bad, because I've done all of those things. And in the book, Nir talks about how to avoid getting distracted by the technology and gadgets that we rely on, and which can actually help us get our stories out into the world. Now, I write and talk a lot about productivity, not because it's something that particularly interests me, but because it's something that I've struggled with. In the past, I've often run out of time, missed deadlines, and struggled, to finish my work and ship it on time. And even though I've learned a little bit more about how to focus and how to get projects over the line, I still get distracted, and I still find that life, can intervene no matter how much time I spend planning. Here's a recent example. A couple of Sundays ago, I spent about an hour planning the week in question. My wife was actually away at the time in Euro Disney with my daughter, and I knew it was going to be a particularly busy week. So I looked at my calendar for the week and I decided what I was going to do and when. And I booked in, when I was going to write, when I was going to interview guests for this show, and when I was going to attend to other business activities like sending an email to my accountant, and also looking at my email list and seeing what I needed to do to improve engagement. I went to bed that night feeling particularly good about everything that I planned and mapped out for the week in question. And I got up early the following morning because I had to drop the baby to the childminder. And I also had a meeting at 9 o'clock that morning, and I knew I had to get all the way across town through traffic. And I remember I opened the front door and I was standing there with the baby, holding a cup of coffee in my hand, and I looked out to where our car should have been, but it was gone. You see, somebody had come into the housing estate during the night, and they'd gone from house to house to house. And when they reached our house, they opened the letterbox, saw the key on the hall table, and used a fishing rod to take the key from the house and drive the car away. At the time, I was more shocked and surprised by what had happened than angry or fearful. And it was only much later when I saw the CCTV footage of two men going around the housing estate in boiler suits and balaclavas that I felt a lot more grateful that they hadn't actually broken into the house, because how terrifying that would have been. As you can imagine, the whole day was upended. I didn't make the meeting in time. I didn't drive all the way across town. And I had to spend much of the morning on the phone to the police, or the Gardaí, as we call them in Ireland, to the insurance company. And then I had to get a new locksmith because I realized they'd also taken the front door keys to the house in question. The theft of the car actually upended the entire week because there was a lot of paperwork and admin I had to do, forms I had to get stamped by the police. And I even had to, find another car so I could attend meetings the following day that week. So suffice to say, I didn't get much writing done despite my planning earlier on in the week. Now, that's an extreme example, and hopefully life doesn't always interfere in your plans to write like that. But there are occasions when, more minor events will pop up. Perhaps there's, a minor emergency at work that you need to spend an extra hour on, and that takes away from your writing for the day. Or perhaps, your website has crashed and you end up spending the morning trying to fix your website when you should have been working on your first draft or your articles. Those are problems I've struggled with too. But what I've learned from these little minor emergencies is that it's okay to miss one day, but it's not okay to miss 2 days. Because when you miss one day, you can always make up for it the following day. But if you start missing a couple of days in a row, then you're building a habit of not turning up and doing the work. Of course, it's all very well and good for me to say this. There are times when I've missed more than one day's writing. There are times when I've got distracted. And there are times when life has intervened and I haven't done very much about it. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about how I could become indestructible, as Nir describes it in his book. So I got in touch with him to talk to him about some of the key ideas that he presents in becoming indestructible. And in the interview, he explains how time boxing and constraints can help writers become more productive and creative. And I'd really recommend this technique if you're struggling to find time to write because you're also, working a day job or you've got family commitments like me. He also gets into why he spent 5 years, yes, that's right, 5 years writing his book, Indistractable. And he gets into the problems with many popular productivity books today. And this is particularly relevant because I've read a lot of productivity books and I have agreed with some of the points that he makes in this interview. And he also describes what his ideal writing routine looks like and how this has changed now that he's in book promotion mode. There's lots more we cover in the interview, but I started off by asking Nir to explain one of the core ideas in his book, the idea of time boxing.
Sure. So time boxing is not a technique I invented. It's one I hope to popularize because the scientific literature about it is fantastic. There is a lot of evidence and many, many studies now, thousands of studies that have shown that setting what's called an implementation intention is a very effective way to do what you say you're going to do. Basically, setting an implementation intention is just a fancy way that the psychologists describe deciding what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. And it turns out that what they're basically advising us to do, these psychologists, and what studies, peer-reviewed studies have verified, is that if you plan ahead, if you decide what it is you want to do and at what time you want to do it, you become much, much more likely to actually follow through. And of course, the sad irony is that so many of us complain about how we can't get things done, about how distracting things are, about how it's not our fault that we can't focus because of technology and this and that. And it turns out that by simply planning what we want to do and when we want to do it, we can overcome many of our distractions. And so that's a very, very important step. And so what I advise is to have a template for what your ideal week looks like and what makes an ideal week. A week that is based on turning your values into time. Instead of having a 5-year plan or a vision board or some kind of grand scheme, why don't we just start with what next week looks like? What would next week look like if you could live out your values to take care of your body, to take care of your mind, to take care of your loved ones, to take care of your work in a proper manner? Ask yourself, how would you spend your time in that week? And so what we want to do is to block out every minute of our day. Don't leave any white space, because the fact is, if you have white space on your calendar, somebody is going to plan your time for you, unless you decide in advance what you want to do with it. Because we can't call something a distraction unless we know what it distracted us from. So we have to account for that time based on how we want to spend that time so that we don't find ourselves wasting it doing something frivolous.
So if I'm time boxing for the first time, am I looking at 15-minute increments or an hour or 4 hours or what's the best way to consider a day?
That's really up to you. Less than 15 minutes is kind of too short, but in my calendar, it's about 30-minute increments throughout the day. And just to be clear, you're not just scheduling time for productive, so to speak, tasks. It's not just work tasks. I want you to make time for, taking care of your body, taking care of, if meditation or prayer is important to you, if time with your family or friends is important to you, if time watching TV is important to you, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. It's about planning that time with intent for however long you want to spend that time doing it. So, for example, I'm not asking you to be, very rigid and plan every single second based on 15-minute increments. For example, on the weekend, I might plan, 3 or 4 hours to spend with my daughter or my wife, and we call this planned spontaneity. And so we don't really know what we're going to do at that time. We may go to the park, we may go to the museum, we may play a board game. We don't know what we're going to do at that time. But I've held that time aside for them so that I know what I will not do at that time. I will not be on my phone checking work email. I will not be on social media. I will not be checking YouTube. I will be fully present with my family.
Yeah, I like that. I have a 9-year-old daughter, so that was something that stood out. I think you had a great idea about putting suggestions in the jar of things to do during time like that. I'm also curious.
Yeah, absolutely. That's our fun jar, right?
Yeah, fun jar. Yeah, that was a great idea. So I'll have to say it to my daughter. She's 9. Yeah, the other thing that struck me is if somebody's time boxing for the first time, but they don't have full control over their day, how should they time box their week? Like, for example, I'm thinking of a writer who's working early in the morning and then they have to go to work during the day and then they have other commitments that they don't have full control over.
Well, I would argue you do have control over that time, probably more control than you think, in that what we have to do is to sync our schedules with the stakeholders in our life. So the first step to time boxing is, of course, accounting for that time, deciding what you want to do with it, but you're not done. The second step is to sit down with the various stakeholders in your life, like your domestic partner, like your boss, and to synchronize your schedule with them so that you're on the same page about how you will spend that time. And so you do actually have more control of that time than you think. For example, if you sit down with your boss and you say, look, boss, this is what I plan to do with my day. Did I account for everything that I need to do? And here's the stuff I don't have time for. Help me reprioritize how to spend that time. And let me tell you, your boss will love this. Bosses don't ask people to do this because they don't want them to think that they're being micromanaged. But your boss is desperate for you to do this if you can sit down with them and synchronize that schedule. And the idea here is when you do that, you're reserving time for the most important tasks, one of which is time to think. So many people, we are constantly reacting all day long to our environment, thinking we have no control because, the emails say this and the phone calls are pinging us and the meetings that have been scheduled for us. We have no control of our time. But that's principally because we haven't carved out the time to do things that we need to do, like time to strategize, time to think, time to be left alone to come up with good ideas, for God's sake. And so that time has to be planned ahead. Now, some jobs are purely reactive jobs. If you work in a call center, your job is to answer the call. It's a purely reactive job. But most jobs out there in the knowledge work sector require some bit of reflection. But we treat every job like it's a reactive job. And so the problem, of course, is that we prioritize the urgent at the expense of the important. So if you don't have time to actually think about that important long-term stuff that requires you to concentrate, well, you're going to be a lot worse at your job. Your company will suffer because you haven't made time for those tasks as well in your day.
Yeah, some strategies I think that you recommended in the book were checking email at predefined periods and the same for instant messaging tools like Slack. And also you had a good one about office hours as well. Do you think it takes long to change from the reactive mindset to what you recommend in the book?
Well, the idea behind becoming indistractable is to be the kind of person who strives to do what they say they're going to do. You don't have to do everything all at once. You don't have to do every technique in the book. I want to give you a lot of arrows in your quiver so that you can use them at your will to become more indistractable. But really, it's about taking one step at a time. So, for example, one of the banes of most office workers' existence these days is email, right? We constantly feel like we have a barrage of email. And if it's not email, it's Slack messages or phone calls or whatever it might be that's pinging and dinging at us. So setting a time in your day when you are not to be interrupted, when you will not be responsive, is a terrific first step. And maybe that's only 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to give you time to actually think. It's amazing. I'll be very honest with you. I get paid thousands of dollars an hour to help people with their personal productivity. And let me let you in on a little secret. 9 times out of 10, all I do is listen. All I do is listen. And people can fix their own problems because by paying me all this money, they've given themselves permission to think. And that's something anybody can do for free. Right? Yeah. You can do that yourself by just giving yourself time to think through your work issues, your home issues, your life issues. Time to strategize is the competitive advantage of this century because nobody is giving themselves that time.
Yeah, it feels like there's more inboxes than ever. I definitely agree that finding time to think is so important. You said there you coach people about personal productivity. So I was reading another book about productivity a while ago, and the author was making the point that the more productive you become, the more work arrives. So it's an endless game, so to speak. Is that something you'd agree with, or is that something you've noticed? It is.
Not only do I agree with it, I've experienced it. And that the reason I wrote this book was that 5 years ago, I published another book. And my first book was very easy to write because nobody was calling me. I wasn't kind of a known author. And then my book did very well. I sold 250,000 copies and I started getting a lot of phone calls, consulting engagement, speaking engagement. And now I had no time to do the one thing that, one, I really enjoyed and made me successful, which was to research and write. And so I was very distracted. And so I wrote Indistractable first and foremost for myself because I was struggling with this problem and, I needed a solution for it. And so I think that's absolutely the case that as people become more successful, they oftentimes don't have time to do the thing that made them successful in the first place. And that's a real problem because, again, we start prioritizing the urgent stuff as opposed to the important stuff. And so that's why it's so important to become indistractable so that we can do the things we know we really should be doing.
Yeah, I remember you said in the book, all right, about it taking 5 years to write it. So that's quite a long time to work on a book.
That's right. And it took me 5 years because I was so distracted.
What did your Indistractable writing routine look like when you got there?
Yeah, so today it took me so long to write this book because it wasn't until about 3 years in that I could finally cement in my mind and in my daily life these practices that are based on thousands of studies. There's 20 pages of citations at the end of the book. Everything in the book is backed by peer-reviewed studies. And so once I discovered these 4 fundamental elements, what it takes to do what you say you're going to do, what it takes to become indistractable, then my productivity soared, right? Then I could become the kind of person who lives with personal integrity. And I started doing what I said I would do every day, not just in work, but also with my health. I would, for years, I would say, oh, I'm definitely going to work out today, but I wouldn't. Or I'm definitely going to eat right today, but I wouldn't. I'm definitely going to be with my daughter and be fully present, but I would get distracted. So this macro skill of becoming indistractable benefited me in all domains of my life.
I think you said you spend about 3 hours a day writing, or at least that's what you were doing when you were working on the books. So now that it's out, have you shifted that routine?
Oh, well, so now I've actually, now I'm in book promotion mode. So I changed how I spend my mornings to now mostly do interviews like this one. But then again, in January, I'll switch back to writing mode. So I let myself have a few months to properly promote the book, and then I'll get back to writing. And I think this is an important point that when you make a time box calendar, it's not set in stone. It's not something you do once and say, this is my calendar for life. No, quite the opposite. It's an iterative process. So every week you sit down with your time box calendar and you assess how you want to spend your time in the week ahead. And you adjust it accordingly. It only takes about 15 minutes. It's very easy to do. But that time that you spend to decide what you want to do in the week ahead is critical to make sure that if your priorities change, if the things that you value change, that you have time for them in the week ahead.
Yeah, on that actually, on change. But what happens if something pops up that, upends the whole day? Like, let's say a couple of weeks ago, my car was stolen from the house. So that upended my...
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was a bit stressful at the time, but it upended actually the whole week. So I'm just wondering how do you plan for something like that? Maybe that's an extreme example, but I suppose a smaller one could be something in work.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry. That's awful. I'm really sorry to hear that. Did you get your car back?
I did not. No, I did not. No, it's the police are investigating it. So yeah, it was a bit unfortunate, but I mean, it could have been worse.
Wow.
It was taken during the night.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
Oh, jeez. Well, and that's actually a great example of this point that I make in the book, that becoming indistractable doesn't mean you never get distracted. It means you strive to be the kind of person who does what they say they're going to do. And so even I get distracted from time to time for things, maybe not quite as tragic as a stolen car, but things do happen in life that you can't predict. Because remember, there's only 3 potential sources of distraction. It's either an external trigger, an internal trigger, or a planning problem. And so the idea is not to beat yourself up if something really goes off track. The idea is to not let that thing keep happening. So if your car gets stolen, that's horrible. But hopefully that doesn't keep happening in your life. Hopefully that's something that is a one-time thing and doesn't continually occur. What I find is a much more pernicious source of distraction is not the 1 in a million thing that happens. It's the things that happen day in and day out that we actually can do quite a bit about. if we tried. So there's this great Paulo Coelho quote. He said, "A mistake repeated more than once is a decision."
Oh, I like that.
So if you don't do something about the problem and it keeps happening again and again, well, you are deciding to let that problem keep happening, to let that distraction keep happening in your life. And so the idea is that if something distracts you once, okay, not your fault. But if it distracts you twice, 3 times, 4 times, for me, it would happen day after day, week after week. I would keep getting distracted by the same stupid thing. Well, now that's my fault. That's my responsibility. I have to do something about it by either removing the external trigger, hacking back, what we call, finding ways to master the internal triggers, or fixing the planning problem, right? Planning, if something continues to distract you, for example, let's say you show up to work late and you say, well, it was the traffic that did it to me. It's not my fault. Traffic was bad. Well, really? Is traffic bad only once a year? No. Traffic might be bad many times per year. So what do? Like, imagine if you had a job interview. You had to be at the job interview at 9 a.m. Would your employer say, oh, yeah, I understand you were 30 minutes late because the traffic was bad? No, they would say, why didn't you come earlier? And so we can plan around these type of things by making sure that we don't keep getting distracted by planning ahead.
And what you've described there actually is there's a fantastic graphic in the book that represents the concepts: internal traction, external distraction. Did it take you long to come up with that visual representation of the key ideas in the book?
It's funny that you should say that. This picture, the visual representation, probably took me longer than writing all the words in the book. Because, getting that picture, and it's hard to describe, through my voice as opposed to the visual, but basically it's, to the right, you have an arrow pointing towards traction. To the left, you have an arrow pointing towards distraction. And then you have 2 arrows pointing from the top and the bottom into the center that are external triggers and internal triggers. And so it's with these 4 steps, these 4 points on the compass, so to speak, you have the fundamental understanding of the problem of distraction and how to become indestructible. These 4 steps of mastering the internal trigger, making time for traction, hacking back the external trigger, and preventing distraction with hack. But, the hard part was filtering out all the noise. There's so much bogus stuff out there about how to be productive that is not supported by scientific evidence. And I didn't want to include any of that stuff in my book. I only wanted to distill down the really important elements that are also backed by good science.
Yeah. And you actually structured the book around the graphic as well. Did you do that at the start or during the editing process?
Yeah. So I collected, it took me about 3 years to collect all the research and to sort out in my own mind what's important, what wasn't important, what were the good studies, what were the not so good studies. And then once I had the model of those 4 steps and I understood the proper order to do these steps, then I could go about actually writing the rest of the book.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to write a book. Yeah, it's unusual because a lot of books like this are broken into 3 acts, whereas your book is 4. But yeah, it was quite a great way to present, scientific information.
Thanks. Yeah. So half the book is about things that you can do yourself, about how you can become indestructible. But then the other half of the book is about this wider context of, I understand that we operate in various environments. So, if your boss demands that you do a project at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, you have to do that project or else you'll get fired, no matter how indestructible you want to be. And so that's why there's a whole section about how to build an indestructible workplace, how to raise indestructible kids, and how to have indestructible relationships. And they all 3 of those sections deal with these outside environments, but also use the same exact 4 steps to help us become indestructible in those various circumstances.
And was there any prevailing wisdom about productivity that you came across that you decided, isn't actually true? Or something about
so much. Yeah, so much. I mean, the book is full of me turning over apple carts. One of the examples, this idea that many people subscribe to, unfortunately, is not backed by good scientific evidence, this idea of ego depletion, which is a fancy term that psychologists use for describing this phenomenon that we run out of willpower. And you've probably heard this in one sense or another, that, that at the end of the day, if you've had a tough day, I would say this to myself all the time. I'd come home from work and I'd say, I'm spent. I have no more willpower. Give me that pint of ice cream and I'm going to sit on the couch and watch Netflix because I'm spent, even though I have 100 things I should be doing. I can't anymore. I have no more willpower left. And there was actually a psychologist who studied this phenomenon and got some traction with it, published a bunch of papers. But then, as is oftentimes the case in the social sciences, a group of psychologists said, you know what, this sounds a little fishy. Let's replicate these studies. And when they tried to replicate the studies, they could not replicate them. They found that, in fact, ego depletion does not exist. You do not run out of willpower like gas in a gas tank. That's not how willpower works. But there was a group of people who actually did exhibit ego depletion, who actually did run out of willpower like gas in a gas tank. And those people, interestingly enough, the only people who did display ego depletion were people who believed in ego depletion. So if you believe that you were spent, that you've run out of willpower, it became so. And so this is such an important lesson because, you know, the way we see ourselves, the way we think about our temperament can have a profound impact on our behaviors. And so this is why I'm on this crusade to fight against this idea that, you know, technology is addicting us, that it's hijacking our brains, that there's nothing we can do about it. Because ironically, when we believe that rubbish, it makes it true. We don't do anything about the problem when we think we can't do anything about it. It's called learned helplessness. And so that's really what I'm trying to fight against, are this way that we construct our self-image in such a way that we really don't serve ourselves. We harm ourselves by imagining our temperament to be something that cannot change, that we are helpless to do anything about. It's a very pernicious way of thinking.
So is it a case that you just need a change of pace or a change of what you're focusing on rather than a break?
Oh, in terms of ego depletion, yes.
Yeah.
The solution is not to think of willpower as a limited resource. Instead, what we need to do is to think about resource, what it really is. According to Michael Inslet, a researcher who looks at this very question, he says that willpower is not a resource. Willpower is an emotion. So just like it would sound ridiculous if I said, oh, I was so angry at you, and then I ran out of anger. That doesn't make any sense. Or, oh, I was having a great time, but then I ran out of happy. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so the same goes when it comes to willpower, that we don't run out of willpower. It's an emotion. And emotions tend to crest and then subside over time, but you don't run out of them. They're just feelings. And so that's a much healthier way to manage a lack of willpower. Yeah, and I talk about it in the book about how to do that.
I believed that study when I read it originally, but you've certainly changed my mind. Finally,
yeah, we all did. Yeah. Me too.
Do you have an ideal early morning routine at the moment? Or do you even believe an ideal early morning routine is important?
Well, I believe in an individual morning routine. I don't like this sense that many people have that there's only one routine that works for one person, and if it works for them, it has to work for everyone. I don't think that there's a magic formula. I think that we each individually can come up with our own best routine. And the reason this is so important is that, you know, if we stick to a very fixed sense of what we have to do, it makes us too rigid in terms of being flexible week over week to change that routine. So, you know, many people say, oh, I'm a morning person or I'm a night owl, and there's no way I can be productive at any other time of the day. Well, that's another self-limiting belief. and even if it is true, even if you have, you know, some slight tendency, the scientific evidence shows that there might be a slight tendency to be one way or the other. You know, would you want to be that rigid? Would you want to make yourself think that you are incapable of doing things any other time of day? And so I think it's important to test for yourself what's effective at different phases of your life. So week over week, you might try one thing one week and then try something else the next week to see what suits you best, without thinking like that, oh, I can only do one plan because that's what the expert told me it should be, or, you know, that's a very rigid plan. However, the time to be rigid is not in formulating the plan. It's when it is already formulated. So once you decide how you want to spend your mornings, how you want to spend your time, then you have to follow through, right? Once you've made your calendar, then you have to stick with it. But to say that there is only one perfect morning routine, I don't know if it's so effective. It really needs to be come up with for the individual.
Yeah, that's a little like what Daniel Pink proposed in his book when he talks about, experimenting about when you should do something. So finally, where can people find your book, Nir?
Yeah, it's available wherever books are sold. It's called Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. And if you go to my website, indestructible.com, there is a complimentary workbook of 80-page workbook that I couldn't fit into the manuscript, so you can get that there for free. There's also a video course available if you get the book that comes along with it, and that's all at indestructible.com.
That's a lot of extra bonuses. I'll be sure and check those out. It was great to talk to you today, Nir.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. If you did, please leave a rating on the iTunes store. And if you want to accomplish more with your writing, please visit becomeawritertoday.com/join and I'll send you a free email course. Thanks for listening.